The story of where the first cities rose may be mostly fiction. For decades, archaeologists believed that complex urban life only emerged in a handful of river valleys, places like Mesopotamia and the Indus. But a flood of new discoveries is shattering that tidy map. Massive settlements are turning up in dense rainforests, arid coasts, and open steppes, built by people who supposedly never had cities. By the end of this video, you will understand why these huge ancient communities stayed hidden for so long, what technology finally revealed them, and how they force us to rewrite the entire story of human civilization. What if our deepest assumptions about progress and place have been wrong from the start? For generations, the textbook story first cities, according to this long-standing narrative, arose in a handful of privileged river valleys. In the Fertile Crescent, along the Tigris and Euphrates, farmers learned to irrigate fields of wheat and barley. Surplus food allowed some people to stop growing their own meals and instead become priests, scribes, or traders. Hierarchies formed, walls went up, and the world's first true cities like Uruk and appeared. A similar story played out along the Nile, where Egyptian civilization coalesced around the annual flood. In the Indus Valley, Harappa and Mohenjo-Daro rose with their grid-like streets and advanced drainage, and across East Asia, early dynasties emerged along the Yellow River. The formula seemed universal: agriculture plus surplus plus central leadership equals cities. This model became the default expectation for the entire field. For decades, archaeologists trained to look for urban life only where they could find evidence of intensive farming, permanent monuments, and clear social stratification. Any region that lacked those signs was assumed to have been sparsely populated or only seasonally occupied by small, mobile groups. The Amazon was considered a green desert incapable of supporting large societies. The steppes of Central Asia were home only to wandering herders. The coasts of Southeast Asia were too wet and forested for anything but scattered fishing villages. These assumptions were so deeply ingrained that when researchers did stumble across hints of something bigger, they often dismissed them as anomalies or misinterpretations. That is exactly why the discoveries that followed felt less like progress and more like a direct challenge to the story archaeologists had told themselves for more than a century. One of the first cracks in the tidy story appeared in central modern-day Turkey, at a place called Çatalhöyük. This settlement dates to around 7,500 BCE, a time long before the great cities of Mesopotamia took shape. Yet it housed up to 8,000 people packed into a dense honeycomb of mud brick homes. There were no streets, there were no plazas or temples or palaces. The houses stood shoulder to shoulder with no gaps between them. People moved across the rooftops, climbing down ladders into their own homes through openings in the ceiling. Each house had its own hearth, its own storage bins, its own burial platforms where generations of residents were laid to rest. Everything about Çatalhöyük defied what archaeologists thought a settlement of that size should look like. It lacked the hallmarks of urban planning: no central authority, no public monuments, no rows of identical houses along defined avenues. Yet it was clearly a thriving community, sustained by farming, trade, and a shared culture that endured for nearly 2,000 years. For researchers trained to see cities as products of rigid hierarchy and monumental architecture, Çatalhöyük was deeply unsettling. It forced a simple but uncomfortable question. If a place with no streets and no rulers could hold 8,000 people, then what else had the old story gotten wrong? This was one of the earliest blows to the linear narrative, a sign that urban life did not follow a single predetermined path. that question would find its most dramatic answer along the arid coast of Peru, where a buried city changed everything. In the late 1990s, archaeologists working in the Soup Valley began uncovering something far older and far more sophisticated than anyone had expected. The site came to be called Caral, a sprawling urban center that, after careful dating, turned out to be about 5,000 years old, roughly the same age as the Great Pyramids of Egypt. What made Caral so shocking was not just its age, but its location and its character. It sat in a dry valley near the Pacific Ocean, a landscape that seemed far too harsh for a complex society to take root. Yet here were monumental pyramids, broad sunken plazas, and an intricate irrigation system that channeled water from distant rivers to fields of cotton and gourds. The residents built stone terraces, raised large ceremonial structures, and organized public works that required careful planning and coordination. And they did all of this without pottery, without a written script, and without the sort of intensive grain agriculture that archaeologists had always considered essential for urban life. For decades, the standard view held that cities could only arise once farmers grew surplus grain, and that pottery was needed to store and cook that grain. Caral overturned both assumptions. Its people grew cotton instead of food, and they fished the rich coastal waters for protein, trading their cotton for fish with neighboring villages. Their buildings were made of stone and earth, carried in woven bags called shikras, a simple but effective technology that left no trace of kilns or fired clay. The lack of writing did not mean a lack of complexity. The layout of Caral, its orientation to celestial events, and its massive public architecture all pointed to a society with sophisticated knowledge of astronomy, engineering, and social organization. The discovery forced researchers to confront a hard truth. The old story of how civilization spreads from a few core regions was not incomplete, it was simply wrong. Caral proved that people could build cities in places that the old model had written off as impossible. And that was only the beginning. As the 21st century progressed, LIDAR technology and satellite imagery would reveal that Caral was not an isolated miracle, but part of a much wider pattern. From the dry coastal valleys of Peru, the search for lost cities moved into one of the most challenging environments on Earth, the dense green canopy of the Amazon rainforest. For centuries, outsiders viewed this vast basin as a kind of wilderness, a place where only small, scattered tribes could ever survive. The soil was poor, the forest too thick, the climate too hostile for anything like a real civilization to take root. That belief persisted well into the 21st century, even as local guides and indigenous communities pointed to raised earthworks and mysterious ditches hidden beneath the trees. Then came the LIDAR surveys and everything changed. Laser pulses fired from aircraft peeled back the forest cover and revealed a landscape that had been carefully engineered for more than 1,000 years. What emerged from the data was not a handful of isolated villages, but a dense network of roads, canals, and platforms linking hundreds of settlements across an area larger than many European countries. Geoglyphs, geometric shapes carved into the earth, stretched for miles. Fortified villages with deep moats and wooden palisades dotted the riverbanks. Some of these settlements held thousands of residents. Researchers now estimate that the pre-Columbian Amazon may have been home to well over 1 million people, perhaps many more. These communities built with earth and timber, not stone, so their cities rotted and sank, swallowed by the very forest they had once shaped. But the traces they left behind are unmistakable. Dark, fertile soils enriched over generations, networks of causeways and canals, and a sophisticated knowledge of how to manage the landscape without destroying it. The idea of a pristine, untouched Amazon was never true. It was always a garden, planted and tended by people whose story had simply been erased by time and by assumptions. From the shadow of the rainforest canopy, the story of unexpected cities now leaps across the Atlantic to the golden steppe of modern-day Ukraine. Here, hidden beneath the plow of centuries of farmland, lie the remains of some of the largest settlements in prehistoric Europe, and they have forced archaeologists to throw out another cherished assumption. These are the Trypilia mega sites, places like Maidanetsk and Nebelivka, which flourished around 4000 BCE, more than 1,000 years before the Great Pyramids of Egypt. At their peak, these settlements covered over 200 hectares, an area roughly the size of 200 soccer fields, and they housed anywhere from 10,000 to 15,000 people. That scale alone was shocking enough in a region that European archaeologists had long dismissed as a backwater, a forest steppe corridor where only small farming villages could survive. But the layout of these settlements was what truly rewrote the rules of ancient urban life. Satellite images and geophysical surveys revealed that the Trypilia mega sites were arranged in concentric rings, with houses arranged in wide arcs around a central open space. The houses themselves were often 2 stories tall, made of timber and clay, and they stood so close together that the rings formed continuous walls of dwellings. Between the rings ran corridors of open ground, some wide enough for livestock and traffic, others narrow and intimate. It looked like a deliberate, planned design, yet there was no evidence of a central palace, a royal tomb, or any single powerful ruler. No grand citadels, no military fortifications, no monumental temples rising above the rooftops. Instead, the organization seemed to come from the community itself. Collective decision-making, shared resources, and a tradition of building and maintaining the rings together generation after generation. The settlements were occupied for several hundred years, then abandoned, possibly as the land grew tired or the social order shifted. But the pattern of those rings remains etched into the soil, visible from above as ghostly circles of darker earth, a fingerprint of a society that found its own way to create a city without a king. For decades, European archaeologists had assumed that urban life in the ancient world required a clear hierarchy and a strong central authority. The Trypilia mega sites challenged that notion completely. They proved that thousands of people could organize themselves, build complex infrastructure, and sustain a dense population in a landscape that was neither a fertile river valley nor a desert oasis, but a grassy plain that flooded and froze and burned with each passing season. Their existence in the forest steppe zone of Ukraine, far from the traditional cradles of civilization in Mesopotamia and Egypt, was a direct affront to the old story. And it raised an even deeper question, one that would drive researchers deeper into the hidden past. If these settlements were so large and sophisticated, why did they leave behind so little trace of conflict or inequality? The answer, as later excavations would show, lies in the way they lived, a way that may force us to rethink what a city even is. The Indus Valley cities shocked the world in the 1920s. When British and Indian archaeologists first began digging into the dusty mounds along the Indus River in what is now Pakistan, they expected to find a provincial outpost of Mesopotamian civilization, a minor trading post on the fringes of the great ancient world. Instead, they uncovered something that rewrote the map of human history. Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa emerged from the earth as fully formed urban centers, planned down to the last brick. Streets ran in a strict grid pattern, oriented to the cardinal directions, with blocks of houses made from standardized baked bricks, all the same size and shape, as if ordered from a single blueprint. Beneath these streets lay an elaborate drainage system, covered clay pipes and brick-lined channels that carried wastewater away from every home, a level of public sanitation that would not be matched in many parts of Europe until the 19th century. There were massive public granaries, a great bath sealed with natural tar, and a carefully engineered water supply that reached even the poorest neighborhoods. These cities were not simple villages grown large. They were built with intention from the ground up, by a society that valued order, hygiene, and cooperation on a massive scale. Yet when these discoveries were announced, the archaeological establishment was deeply unsettled. The Indus region was classified as a periphery, a secondary zone that could not possibly have given rise to a civilization as complex as Mesopotamia. The assumption had been that civilization spread like a wave from the Near East, carried by migrants or traders who brought the secrets of city life to less advanced peoples. The Indus cities proved that this wave theory was wrong. Here was a civilization that was older than many Mesopotamian cities, built on a different model with its own script, its own artistic traditions, and its own system of weights and measures. The pattern of surprise was already established a century ago. Every time archaeologists thought they had pinned down the origins of urban life, a spade in the ground would turn up something that did not fit. The difference today is that the pace of those surprises has accelerated dramatically. Back in the 1920s, a single excavation could take a decade or more, and the data was filtered through the biases of colonial scholarship. Modern survey methods, from satellite imagery to ground-penetrating radar, scan vast landscapes in days, revealing the hidden fingerprints of ancient settlements that no one ever expected to find. The old pattern of discovery was slow and incremental, a gradual filling in of a known map. The new pattern is a flood, a constant rewriting of the map itself. The Indus Valley cities were the first major tremor, but they were far from the last. Today, as researchers look back at those early excavations, they realize that the surprises they uncovered then were just a preview of a much larger reshuffling of the story. One that is still unfolding every time a LIDAR scan reveals a new pattern beneath the green canopy, or a geophysical survey traces the ghost of a lost settlement in the soil. The question is no longer whether there were cities in unexpected places. The question is how many more are still waiting to be found, and what those discoveries will force us to unlearn. For centuries, the earliest chapter of Chinese civilization had a clear and well-accepted starting point: the Shang dynasty. School textbooks taught that Chinese cities emerged around the 2nd millennium BC, with their great capital at Anyang, complete with royal tombs and inscribed oracle bones. The Shang were considered the first true Bronze Age civilization in East Asia, and everything before them was seen as a vague and primitive prelude. Then, in the 1950s, a farmer in the Yellow River Valley near the modern city of Luoyang turned up some unusual pottery shards and fragments of bronze. The site was called Erlitou. Decades of careful excavation would reveal something that shattered the timeline of an entire civilization. Here lay the remains of a Bronze Age settlement that may have housed as many as 30,000 people. A city that flourished more than 300 years before the Shang dynasty even began. Its scale dwarfed any contemporary site in the region. The layout was unmistakably planned, a grid of roads and lanes, residential areas separated from elite precincts, and a carefully leveled palace foundation that required staggering amounts of earth-moving work. The palace complex covered an area equivalent to several modern city blocks, and its rammed earth walls and columns supported a roof structure that would have towered above the surrounding houses. But what truly marked Erlitou as a revolutionary discovery were its bronze workshops. Inside these buildings, archaeologists found molds and crucibles and fragments of ritual vessels, objects that had once been considered trademarks of the Shang alone. The bronzes of Erlitou were earlier, different in style, but unmistakably the product of a highly skilled metalworking tradition. This was not a simple village that grew into a town. This was a planned urban center with specialized industries, a ruling class, and a sophisticated system of resource extraction and trade. The grid layout itself was a statement of intention. Streets ran straight and true, dividing the city into functional blocks, a design that required central coordination and long-term planning. The implications hit the field of Chinese archaeology like a shock wave. If Erlitou predated the Shang by several centuries, then the traditional narrative, which placed the origin of Chinese civilization squarely at the Shang capital of Anyang, was no longer tenable. The roots of Bronze Age urbanism in East Asia were older and deeper than anyone had imagined. But who built Erlitou? Who ruled it? The archaeological record offers tantalizing clues but no names. The site aligns with the Xia dynasty, a legendary ruling house mentioned in later Chinese texts but long dismissed as myth because of a complete lack of physical evidence. State historians had debated for generations whether the Xia ever existed. Erlitou could not provide a written inscription or a royal name, but it gave researchers something almost as valuable, a material footprint matching the time and place of the Xia legend. That does not prove the Xia were real, not in the way we think of dynasties with named kings, but it does prove that a sophisticated urban society existed precisely when and where the ancient text said it should. The discovery at Erlitou forced a radical rethinking not just of Chinese history, but of the very methods used to link legend to excavation. For decades, archaeologists had relied on oracle bones and bronze inscriptions to anchor the timeline. Erlitou had neither, yet its scale and complexity demanded a new framework, one that could handle societies that left no written records but built cities all the same. The old story of China, which had a neat beginning at Anyang and a clear line of descent through the dynasties, was suddenly full of gaps and shadows. And the strangest part is that Erlitou itself is still not fully understood. Its decline and abandonment remain a mystery. The palace was burned, the workshops fell silent, and the site was slowly swallowed by the Yellow River's shifting course. The people who built that grid, who cast those bronze vessels, who designed that massive foundation, simply vanished from the archaeological record, leaving only their city behind as a challenge to everything we thought we knew about where civilization begins. Far to the south, in the rolling hills of modern-day Zimbabwe, another stone city stood silent for centuries before the world was willing to see it for what it truly was. Great Zimbabwe, a sprawling complex of dry stone walls and towering enclosures, once housed as many as 18,000 people. Its construction began around the 11th century and reached its peak 300 years later, when the city's rulers controlled trade routes stretching from the gold fields of the interior to the Swahili coast of the Indian Ocean. The most breathtaking feature of Great Zimbabwe is the Great Enclosure, a massive circular wall made of granite blocks stacked without mortar, rising to a height of 11 meters in some places and stretching for nearly 250 meters around. The precision of the stonework, the careful fitting of perfectly shaped blocks, the way the wall curves in a graceful arc with no visible seam, all of it testifies to a sophisticated architectural tradition that developed entirely on its own terms. Inside the enclosure, archaeologists found soapstone bird carvings, gold jewelry, and imported goods from as far away as Persia and China. This was not a simple village or a seasonal camp. It was a capital, a commercial hub, and a center of ritual life that rivaled any medieval city in Europe or Asia. Yet when European explorers first encountered the ruins in the late 19th century, they refused to accept that local Africans could have built them. Colonial narratives insisted that such advanced architecture must have come from outsiders, Phoenicians or Egyptians, or even the lost tribes of Israel. It took decades of careful archaeology, led largely by Zimbabwean and other African scholars, to establish the obvious truth. Great Zimbabwe was built by the ancestors of the Shona people, a thriving indigenous civilization that had its own kings, its own economy, and its own urban traditions. The refusal to see this was not a simple mistake. It was a reflection of a deep-seated bias that assumed sub-Saharan Africa had no cities of its own. That same bias blinded researchers to the city of Jenne-Jeno, hidden in the floodplains of the Niger River in modern-day Mali. Discovered in the 1970s by Susan and Roderick McIntosh, Jenne-Jeno is one of the oldest known urban centers in sub-Saharan Africa, with continuous occupation from around 250 BC to the 14th century CE. At its peak, the city covered more than 30 hectares and housed thousands of people in dense clusters of mud brick houses, all surrounded by a massive defensive wall. The residents were farmers, fishers, and metalworkers, and they traded goods along the river to cities as far north as the Sahara and as far south as the coastal forests. The most remarkable feature of Jenne-Jeno is not its size or its age, but its urban structure. There was no central palace, no temple complex, no sign of a single ruler or elite class. Instead, the city seems to have been organized through a network of specialized neighborhoods, each focused on a different craft or industry. There was a district for iron smelters, another for potters, another for traders. This layout suggests a society that valued collective decision-making and economic cooperation over centralized authority. The idea that a city could thrive without a king or a priestly hierarchy was so foreign to the colonial mindset that many early researchers struggled to accept Jenne-Jeno as a true urban center. But the evidence is undeniable. The layers of ash and charcoal, the fragments of terracotta figurines, the remains of imported glass beads and copper ornaments, all of it points to a vibrant, self-organizing community that flourished for more than a millennium. Great Zimbabwe and Jenne-Jeno share a common fate. Both were dismissed or explained away by outsiders who could not fit them into their narrow map of what civilization was supposed to look like. The colonial era had drawn a mental line across the Sahara, below which it was assumed no true cities could exist. That line was wrong. The stones of Great Zimbabwe and the mud walls of Jenne-Jeno stand as proof that urban life in Africa was not a late arrival or a foreign import, but a deep-rooted tradition that shaped the continent for thousands of years. The map of expected settlements was never a map of reality. It was a map of prejudice, and as researchers continue to dig, both literally and metaphorically, that old map is dissolving, revealing a world where cities rose in places that the old stories never dreamed of. On the floodplains of the Mississippi, a city rose that rewrote the story of a continent. Around the year 1100 of the Common Era, long before any European set foot in the interior of North America, a settlement called Cahokia stood at the heart of what is now Illinois, just across from modern-day St. Louis. At its peak, this urban center held between 20,000 and 40,000 people, a population that made it larger than London at the same time. Its centerpiece was an enormous earthen mound, known today as Monk's Mound, that rose in 4 terraces to a height of about 30 meters, covering an area larger than the base of the Great Pyramid of Giza. That mound was not built by slaves under the whip of a distant king. It was constructed basket load by basket load, millions of basket loads of soil carried by hand over generations, a feat of organization and shared purpose that still baffles engineers. Surrounding Monk's Mound lay a carefully planned urban grid, wide plazas, residential districts, and more than 100 smaller mounds used for ceremonies, burials, and elite residences. A wooden palisade, rebuilt several times, enclosed the central precinct, but the residential neighborhood stretched for miles along the river terraces. The people of Cahokia were farmers who grew corn, squash, and beans in the rich alluvial soil of the American bottom, but they also hunted, fished, and traded across a network that reached from the Gulf of Mexico to the Great Lakes. Copper from the Lake Superior region, shells from the Atlantic coast, and stones from the Rocky Mountains all passed through Cahokia's markets. For centuries, the standard view held that pre-Columbian North America was home only to small, nomadic bands scattered across a vast and empty wilderness. Cahokia proved that view was not just incomplete, it was a wholesale erasure of a complex urban civilization that arose on its own terms, built with timber and earth instead of stone, and thrived for more than 300 years before its slow decline and eventual abandonment. The site was rediscovered by European settlers in the early 19th century, but for decades it was dismissed as a natural hill or the work of a mysterious lost race, anything but the creation of the native peoples whose descendants still lived nearby. It took careful excavation and a shift in perspective to recognize that the Great Mound at Cahokia was not a geological accident, but the center of a city that challenged every assumption about life in North America before contact. The story of Cahokia is not just a story of one place. It is a reminder that the map of ancient urbanism still holds blank spaces, and that the most unsettling discoveries are often those that force us to see familiar landscapes in an entirely new light. The most stubborn assumption was about the land itself. For generations, researchers looked at a region and made a quick judgment: too wet, too dry, too poor, too steep, too anything to ever support a real city. They called these places marginal, as if the environment itself had decreed that civilization could never take root there. The Amazon rainforest was dismissed as a green desert, its soils too thin and acidic for intensive farming, its canopy too dense for any kind of centralized society. The arid coast of Peru was considered a barren strip, too dry for crops that could feed thousands. The open steppe of Ukraine was seen as a grassy corridor suitable only for wandering herders, never for a permanent settlement of 10,000 people. These judgments felt scientific at the time. They were based on soil maps, rainfall averages, and a simple model of what agriculture required. But that model was built on a narrow set of assumptions that ignored the ingenuity of the people who actually lived in those landscapes. The Amazon was not a natural wilderness. It was a garden, carefully managed for centuries with a technique that produced dark, fertile soil known as terra preta. That soil, enriched by charcoal and organic waste, could support dense populations in places that would otherwise be barren. The coast of Peru was arid, but the rivers that flowed from the Andes carried meltwater that, when channeled through canals, turned the valleys into lush ribbons of cotton, beans, and squash. The steppe of Ukraine had deep, rich soil called Chernozem, black earth that could produce grain harvests large enough to feed entire towns. What modern researchers called marginal was actually abundant, but only if you knew how to work with the land instead of against it. The problem was not the environment itself. The problem was that the people who made these judgments had never learned the local knowledge that had sustained these settlements for centuries or millennia. They looked at rainfall charts and soil cores and saw only limits, but the ancient inhabitants saw possibilities: floodplains to be irrigated, forests to be managed, grasslands to be rotated, marine resources to be harvested. The assumptions of marginal land were not just wrong. They were a mirror of the researchers' own blindness to the full range of human adaptation, and that blindness had consequences. It meant that entire chapters of human history remained hidden, not because the evidence was buried too deep, but because the people who held the shovels did not believe there was anything worth finding. So the first reason these massive settlements stayed unexpected was simply that the places they were built in did not fit the mental map of where cities were supposed to appear. That map is now being redrawn, and every new discovery adds another layer to a story that is far more complex and more surprising than anyone ever guessed. And if the environment itself was misjudged, then what other deep-seated biases have been shaping the way we see the past? The second reason these settlements stayed hidden so long runs even deeper than geography. It is the assumption that human societies evolve along a single ladder, climbing step by step from simple bands to tribes to chiefdoms, and finally to fully formed states with kings, taxes, and standing armies. For more than a century, this model shaped how archaeologists interpreted the past. If a site did not show clear signs of hierarchy, monument building, or centralized record keeping, it was automatically classified as primitive, stuck on a lower rung of development. That ladder became a straitjacket, squeezing the rich variety of human organization into a narrow set of expectations. But the settlements we have been exploring refuse to fit that mold. They offer a different story, one where cooperation replaces central authority, where dense populations thrive without bureaucrats, and where complex economies function without the heavy hand of a ruler. The Trypillia mega sites of Ukraine are a perfect example. These sprawling settlements held thousands of people, arranged in concentric rings with shared communal spaces. Yet excavations have turned up no palaces, no royal tombs, no signs of a single dominant leader. The houses are remarkably similar in size and contents, suggesting a society that valued equality over accumulation. How did they coordinate the construction of those massive rings or organize the distribution of food and resources? They developed systems of collective decision-making, perhaps through councils or assemblies that left no physical trace. The absence of a palace does not mean chaos. It means a different kind of order. The same pattern appears at Çatalhöyük, where 8,000 people lived in a honeycomb of identical homes with no streets, no temples, no monuments to a single ruler. They buried their dead beneath the floors of their own houses, keeping their ancestors close rather than placing them in grand tombs. The lack of centralization was not a failure. It was an intentional way of life. The people of Jenne-Jeno in West Africa took this even further. Their city was divided into specialized craft districts, ironworkers, potters, traders, each cluster operating with a high degree of autonomy. There was no king, no tax collector, no standing army, yet the city thrived for more than 1,000 years, trading across the Sahara and down the Niger River. The old ladder model would have labeled Jenne-Jeno a chiefdom at best, a step below true statehood. But that label misses the point entirely. These were not failed states, they were successful non-states, urban societies that solved the challenges of density, trade, and coordination without the rigid hierarchies that Western scholars assumed were inevitable. The bias was built into the very language of archaeology. Terms like complex society, civilization, and urban revolution carried embedded assumptions about hierarchy and writing and monumental architecture. When researchers found a place like Caral in Peru, with its pyramids and plazas but no pottery or written script, they had to invent new categories or stretch the old ones. The easiest path was to call Caral a ceremonial center and move on, rather than admit that its people had built a city using a different playbook. The playbook of linear evolution came straight from 19th century European thought, where thinkers like Lewis Henry Morgan and Herbert Spencer described a ladder from savagery to barbarism to civilization, with their own society sitting smugly at the top. That framework was exported around the world and applied to every culture archaeologists encountered. It turned history into a race, and everyone who did not build pyramids or invent writing was judged as lagging behind. The truth, as these unexpected settlements reveal, is that there never was a single ladder. There were many paths branching and looping and sometimes reversing. The societies that built Çatalhöyük, Trypilia, Jenne-Jeno, and Caral were not earlier versions of Mesopotamia or Egypt. They were alternative versions, experiments in urban life that took different routes to the same destination, a settled, populous, and sustainable community. The old model treated hierarchy as inevitable, a natural step toward efficiency and order. But these sites show that dense, organized urban life can flourish without it. They ask a quiet but powerful question. What if the path we call progress, with its kings and priests and tax collectors, was just one option among many? What if other societies looked at that option and chose something else? The evidence is now strong enough to force a revision of the textbooks. The ladder is broken, and the pieces are scattered across landscapes that archaeologists once dismissed as marginal. The next time a drone flies over a forest or a satellite scans a desert, the image that comes back might reveal another city built on an entirely different set of rules, and with it, another crack in the old story of how we became who we are. But there is a deeper reason even the most careful surveys missed so many of these settlements for so long. It is not just about where they were built or how they were organized. It is about what they were made of and what happened to them afterward. For centuries, archaeologists based their understanding of ancient cities almost entirely on sites that survived in plain sight. Stone temples in dry deserts, marble columns in Mediterranean ruins, brick ziggurats in arid river valleys. Those structures endured because their materials resisted decay and their climates offered little moisture to break them down. But most of the world's population throughout history built with wood, earth, thatch, and clay. Those materials do not last. They rot, collapse, wash away, or get buried under layers of newer debris. The cities we have found so far are not a representative sample of what once existed. They are a sample heavily skewed toward the lucky few that happened to be built in places where preservation was possible. The Trypillia mega sites of Ukraine, for example, were constructed from timber and clay, with walls of wattle and daub packed over wooden frames. When those communities moved on or declined, the houses slowly crumbled into mounds of earth. Over centuries, wind and rain spread those mounds flat, and farmers plowed the soil, scattering the remnants even further. If a satellite passes over now, it sees only gentle undulations in the fields, barely visible unless the light is just right. The same fate befell the wooden palisades of Cahokia and the thatched roofs of Jenne-Jeno. Their cities did not vanish because they were small or insignificant. They vanished because nature consumed them. In the Amazon, the forest did the job even faster. The raised platforms and causeways of pre-Columbian settlements were built from earth and packed with organic matter. Once abandoned, the jungle reclaimed the land within a single generation. Roots pushed through the mounds, vines covered the canals, and the dense canopy hid everything from view. For hundreds of years, the only hints were occasional patches of dark soil or a strange symmetry in the undergrowth that only a trained eye might notice. And then there is the deliberate destruction, not always malicious but practical. Later settlers often built right on top of older cities. In many parts of Europe and Asia, medieval towns rose directly above Roman ruins, and Roman towns rose above Iron Age settlements. Each layer added meters of debris, burying the older remains so deeply that no one even knew they were there. The city of Troy was not a single city, but a stack of 9, each built on the rubble of the one before. The same is true for hundreds of sites around the world, where the newest construction sits on a buried history that only shows itself when someone digs a foundation or a well. What this means is that the archaeological record is not a random sample of past human life. It is a collection of survivors, the ones that were lucky enough to avoid rot, flood, fire, and reuse. Entire urban traditions built from bamboo, palm fronds, or animal hides have left almost no trace, and we may never know how many cities perished without a whisper. The invention of aerial LIDAR and ground-penetrating radar is changing this picture dramatically. These technologies can see through forest canopies and penetrate several meters of soil, revealing the outlines of buried walls, roads, and even fields. LIDAR surveys in the Amazon have already exposed more than 1,000 geometric earthworks that were invisible from the ground. In Central Europe, geophysical scans have traced entire Bronze Age settlements beneath modern farmland. The old assumption that cities required stone is collapsing because we are finally able to see what we were missing. Every new scan reveals another layer of human ingenuity that had been hiding in plain sight, waiting for the right tool to bring it back into the light. And that raises a humbling thought. If our current knowledge of ancient cities is so incomplete, how many more are still waiting beneath the soil or under the trees? The answer is almost certainly more than we can imagine, and each one will force us to revise the story yet again. The first tool to pierce that silence was not a laser or a satellite. It was a simple camera strapped to an airplane. In the 1920s, pilots of the Royal Air Force were flying routine survey missions across the Middle East, mapping newly drawn borders and oil pipelines. But as they banked over the dry plains of Iraq and Syria, they noticed something odd. From the air, vast geometric patterns emerged in the landscape, lines and rectangles that were invisible from the ground. These were not natural formations. They were the faint outlines of buried walls and ditches, preserved just beneath the surface, waiting for an observer who could see the whole picture at once. The pilots snapped photographs, and soon archaeologists began to understand what they were seeing. The phenomenon is called a crop mark. When ancient foundations, stone walls or packed mud lie just below the surface, they affect the soil above. The roots of wheat or barley growing over a buried wall hit a shallow layer of rubble. They cannot reach deep moisture, so the plants grow shorter, thinner, and they ripen faster, turning yellow earlier than the rest of the field. Over a filled ditch, the opposite happens. The soil is deeper and richer, so the crops grow taller and stay greener longer. From above, these differences paint a hidden map, ghostly outlines of rooms, streets, and whole neighborhoods that have been plowed flat for centuries. In Europe, where fields are turned year after year, crop marks have revealed thousands of settlements that left no standing stone. Roman villas, Iron Age roundhouses, Neolithic causewayed enclosures, they all show up as subtle variations in the color of a wheat field, visible only from altitude and only at the right time of year. The same principle works with soil marks. When the ground is freshly plowed, darker soil that once filled a ditch stands out against the lighter subsoil, while the pale spots of eroded stone walls appear as bleached rectangles. So powerful is this method that archaeologists in the 1930s and 40s could map entire buried cities from a single flight of photographs, long before they ever picked up a shovel. But the true revolution came with the Cold War. The United States launched a series of spy satellites under the codename Corona, designed to photograph Soviet missile sites and military installations from orbit. The earliest missions between 1960 and 1972 returned thousands of rolls of film, dropped back to Earth in metal capsules that were snagged midair by waiting aircraft. When those photographs were finally declassified in the 1990s, archaeologists realized they had stumbled upon a treasure. The Corona images covered huge swaths of the Middle East, Anatolia, and Central Asia, precisely the regions where the oldest cities lay buried beneath millennia of silt and sand. The resolution was good enough to pick out ancient canals, field systems, and the outlines of tells, the layered mounds that mark long abandoned settlements. Researchers could compare images from the 1960s with modern landscapes and see how looting, urban sprawl, and intensive farming had erased the very features the old photos preserved. In Syria alone, Corona imagery helped identify more than 10,000 archaeological sites that had been invisible to ground surveys. In the Iraqi marshlands, it revealed a network of irrigation canals and settlement mounds that dated back to the Sumerian period, a vast hydraulic landscape that had been drowned under modern drainage projects. The power of these images is not just that they see through time, but that they freeze a moment before the damage was done. The old aerial photographs and declassified spy shots offer a baseline, a record of what was still visible on the surface before the bulldozers and the plows and the relentless growth of modern cities erased the last traces. And yet, even with these tools, so much remains hidden. The best photographs can only reveal what the surface itself chooses to show. If a buried city lies under 3 meters of alluvium or deep forest soil, no crop mark will appear. The next leap from aerial eyes to laser eyes was about to change everything. That next leap measured distance with light. Light detection and ranging, or LIDAR for short, is a technology that does exactly what its name suggests. A small aircraft flies low over a forest, and from its belly, a laser scanner fires pulses of light toward the ground, millions of them every minute. Each pulse hits the top of the canopy, then the branches below, then the shrubs, and finally the soil. A sensor measures the time it takes for every single reflection to bounce back, and from those tiny time intervals, a computer builds an elevation map of everything the laser touched. The raw data looks like a dense cloud of points, a three-dimensional scatter plot of leaves, trunks, and earth. Then comes the magic. Software strips away every point that falls above the ground, removing the canopy, the understory, the fallen logs, until only the bare contour of the land remains. What emerges is a digital ghost of the forest floor, a terrain map so precise that it reveals undulations of just a few centimeters. And in those subtle bumps and ridges, archaeologists began to see shapes they had never noticed before. The first dramatic proof came from the Maya lowlands of Central America, where a team of researchers flying over northern Guatemala in 2016 fired LIDAR pulses across more than 2,000 square kilometers of dense jungle. The resulting images were nothing short of a revolution. Beneath the tree cover lay the outlines of tens of thousands of structures, stone platforms, terraced hillsides, defensive walls, and raised roads that connected entire networks of settlements. The scale was staggering. What had once been mapped as scattered ceremonial centers turned out to be a fully integrated urban landscape, a civilization that had shaped the land on a massive scale, all hidden beneath a canopy that had never been penetrated by ground survey. In the Patane region alone, LIDAR revealed more than 60,000 house mounds, causeways spanning kilometers, and elaborate water management systems with reservoirs and canals. The population estimates for the classic Maya period were revised upward, from a few million to as many as 15 million people, a number that placed them among the most densely populated civilizations of their time. And those discoveries were just the beginning. The same technology moved east to the Amazon, where researchers had long suspected that the forest held secrets, but had no way to prove it. LIDAR flights over the southern rim of the basin, particularly in the Llanos de Mojos region of Bolivia and the upper Xingu region of Brazil, revealed a landscape that had been engineered for centuries. Geometric earthworks, perfect circles and rectangles carved into the terrain, formed the foundations of fortified villages connected by raised causeways. Canals and reservoirs suggested sophisticated water management in a region that flooded half the year and dried out the other half. The dark soil deposits, called terra preta, appeared in concentrated patches around these settlements, evidence of long-term occupation and enrichment of the land. The picture that emerged was of a populous, settled society that had built towns and roads and agricultural systems across the forest, a civilization that had been erased from history simply because its architecture was made of earth and wood, not stone. LIDAR saw what the naked eye could never see through the green wall. Further west in Southeast Asia, the technology targeted the sprawling temple complex of Angkor Wat in Cambodia. For decades, archaeologists knew that the temples were surrounded by a vast medieval city, but the scale always remained a mystery. The forest had swallowed the suburbs, leaving only hints of roads and reservoirs beneath the undergrowth. LIDAR surveys in 2012 and again in 2015 pulled back the canopy and revealed a grid of streets and canals extending far beyond anything the textbooks had predicted. The city of Angkor, it turned out, covered nearly 1,000 square kilometers, making it the most extensive urban complex of the pre-industrial world. Its water management network alone, channels, dikes, and enormous reservoirs called barrages, was an engineering achievement that rivaled anything in the ancient world. And beneath all of it lay the foundation of a planned metropolis, with neighborhoods, markets, and industrial zones connected by a network of highways that radiated from the temple core. Each new LIDAR survey peels back another layer of that hidden world. In Honduras, a flight over the Mosquisha rainforest revealed what may be the remains of a lost city, sometimes called the White City, with plazas and pyramidal mounds that had been swallowed by the jungle for centuries. In the Pacific Islands, LIDAR picked out the terraced hillsides and fish ponds of ancient Hawaiian settlements that had been invisible under invasive thicket. Everywhere the lasers pointed, they found evidence of human presence that the old maps had dismissed as impossible. The technology did not just find new sites. It challenged the definition of what a city looks like when it dies. Stone cities leave ruins that we can stumble through and catalogue. Earth and timber cities leave only faint contours, the memory of a mound, the trace of a ditch, the shadow of a road worn into the soil. LIDAR revealed that these subtle shapes are not random. They are the blueprints of vanished worlds, readable for the first time from the air. The silence of the forest, the flat look of a grassy plain, the unbroken green of a hillside, all of it has been hiding stories that the laser can now illuminate. And the most humbling realization is that we have only just begun to look. But the most detailed pictures come from machines that never leave the ground. While LIDAR sees through forest canopies from above, a different set of tools works at soil level, reading the buried remains of ancient settlements like a physician reading an X-ray. These are the geophysical methods, and in the last 3 decades they have transformed how archaeologists look at the plowed fields and open pastures of Europe, Asia, and beyond. Magnetometry is the most widely used of these techniques. Every archaeological feature that has been heated to high temperatures, a hearth, a kiln, a furnace, leaves a permanent magnetic signature in the soil. The intense heat realigns the iron particles in the clay beneath, creating a tiny magnetic field that is slightly stronger than the surrounding earth. A magnetometer towed across a field on a cart or carried by hand measures these variations with incredible sensitivity. A buried kiln from a Roman pottery works, a collapsed hearth from a Bronze Age roundhouse, even the iron-rich soils that filled an ancient ditch, all of them appear as distinct blips on the survey map. The machine detects them in minutes, long before a shovel ever touches the ground. Ground-penetrating radar works on a different principle. It sends a pulse of radio waves into the soil, and when those waves hit a boundary between materials, a stone wall against loose earth, a void where a wooden post once stood, part of the signal bounces back. The radar unit records the time it takes for each echo to return, and from that timing it builds a cross-sectional image of what lies beneath, layer by layer. In a few hours, a team can walk a grid across a single hectare and produce a detailed map of buried foundations, trenches, and even individual rooms, all without disturbing a single shovelful of dirt. At the Trypillia sites in Ukraine, ground-penetrating radar revealed the exact footprint of 2-story timber houses, their fallen walls and collapsed floors still visible as distinct bands of radar reflection. The third method, electrical resistivity, is simpler and older but no less powerful. It works by injecting a small electrical current into the ground through 2 metal probes and measuring how easily the current flows. Stone and packed earth resist the current strongly, while moist, loose soil conducts it easily. A buried stone wall shows up as a high-resistance anomaly. A filled ditch appears as a low-resistance one. By dragging a frame of 4 probes across a field in a regular pattern, researchers can create a map of the subsurface that reveals the outlines of entire settlements, their streets, their boundaries, their drainage channels, as clearly as if the soil had been stripped away. When these 3 methods are used together, the picture becomes remarkably complete. Magnetometry finds the hearths and industrial zones. Ground-penetrating radar reveals the depth and shape of foundations. Electrical resistivity maps the overall layout of walls and ditches. In the Carpathian Basin of Hungary and Romania, systematic geophysical surveys over the past 2 decades have tripled the known density of prehistoric settlements. Where once researchers counted a few dozen scattered sites, they now see hundreds, clustered along ancient river terraces and connected by faint traces of roads and field systems. The surface of a plowed field that looks empty to the naked eye turns out to be a palimpsest of buried villages, each one built on the ruins of its predecessor, stacked like layers of a book that only geophysics can read. These ground-based tools do not require expensive aircraft or laser scanners. They can be deployed by a small team with a trailer and a laptop, working across fields during the harvest off-season. And they have proven that even in landscapes that have been farmed for centuries, the past remains just a few centimeters below the plow, waiting for the right machine to wake it. The silent contours that LIDAR reveals from above are matched by the hidden signatures that magnetometers and radar uncover from below. Together, they have turned the search for lost cities from a slow, laborious dig into a rapid, systematic survey. And every new survey raises the same quiet question. If we have missed so much in the most heavily studied regions of Europe, what lies waiting beneath the vast, unexplored plains of Asia, the savannas of Africa, the tundras of Siberia? The ground itself is a library, and we have only just learned how to open its pages. Sometimes the library opens itself by accident. For all the careful planning, the LIDAR flights and geophysical surveys and decades of deliberate excavation, some of the most transformative discoveries in archaeology began not with a researcher's hypothesis, but with the rumble of a bulldozer or the scrape of a quarry shovel. Infrastructure projects, roads, pipelines, mines, housing developments cut through the earth on an industrial scale, and in doing so, they slice into layers that have lain undisturbed for millennia. The result is a constant, unpredictable stream of accidental finds, moments when a machine operator glances down and sees something that does not belong, a row of stones, a shard of painted pottery, a dark stain in the soil that marks the outline of a buried wall. Most of these encounters end quietly with a quick report and a small salvage dig, but a few of them change the course of an entire discipline. On the Greek island of Santorini in the late 1860s, workers were quarrying volcanic pumice for building materials, a common trade on an island shaped by ancient eruptions. As they cut into the cliffs, they began to uncover walls, rooms, and fragments of frescoes, the remains of a settlement that had been buried under meters of ash and pumice when the volcano erupted around 1600 BC. That settlement was Akrotiri, a Bronze Age city preserved in stunning detail, with 3-story buildings, elaborate murals of ships and monkeys and saffron gatherers, and advanced plumbing systems that seemed centuries ahead of their time. The quarrymen had stumbled onto a time capsule, a Minoan-era city frozen in the very moment of its destruction, and they did not even realize what they had found until trained archaeologists arrived to interpret the ruins. For decades afterward, the site yielded a steady flow of discoveries that reshaped our understanding of Aegean civilization, its trade networks, its artistic achievements, and the devastating eruption that brought its world to an end. None of it would have happened without a quarry pit dug for a completely different purpose. A similar accident, equally improbable, unfolded on a dusty hillside in southeastern Turkey in the 1990s. A farmer named Şafak Yıldız was clearing his field, removing the rubble that littered the soil when he noticed something strange. Among the stones, there were large, carefully shaped slabs, too regular to be natural, too heavy to be moved by hand. He had stumbled onto a site that would later be called Göbekli Tepe, a name that translates roughly to Potbelly Hill. The farmer reported his find to local museum officials, who alerted archaeologists, and what followed was one of the most stunning revelations in the history of the field. The site turned out to be a massive complex of carved limestone pillars arranged in circular enclosures, each pillar weighing up to 20 tons and decorated with intricate reliefs of foxes, boars, snakes, and scorpions. Most shockingly of all, radiocarbon dating placed the construction of the oldest enclosures at around 9,500 BCE, more than 6,000 years before the pyramids of Egypt, at a time when the standard story insisted that humans were still simple hunter-gatherers, incapable of organizing such a massive public work. The discovery at Göbekli Tepe did not just add another entry to the map of ancient cities. It demolished the fundamental assumption that agriculture preceded monumental building. Here was a central gathering place with no signs of permanent settlement, no houses, no kitchens, no fields. Yet the effort required to quarry, shape, and transport those stone pillars would have demanded the labor of hundreds of people over generations. This was a monument built before the invention of the plow, before the domestication of most animals, before the settled village life that textbooks had always considered the necessary foundation for civilization. The farmer who cleared those stones out of his field had no way of knowing he was holding a piece of a puzzle that would force an entire generation of researchers to rethink the story of how humans first came together to build something greater than themselves. These chance encounters happen more often than most people realize. Highway construction in southern China in the early 2000s revealed a massive Neolithic site with monumental jade carvings that pushed back the timeline of complex societies in East Asia. Pipeline digging across the steppes of Kazakhstan exposed a chain of Bronze Age mounded tombs that held gold artifacts and chariot burials, evidence of a mobile but highly stratified society that controlled trade across the heart of the continent. In the United States, the expansion of a housing development in Mississippi in the 1990s uncovered the remains of a pre-Columbian settlement that became the site of the famed Emerald Mound, a massive earthwork that rivaled anything in the Mississippian world. In every case, the discovery was not driven by a research question, but by a practical need to dig, to build, to move Earth for a purpose that had nothing to do with the past. The result is a constant, unpredictable rhythm of revelation. The roads we drive on, the gas lines that heat our homes, the gravel pits that supply our concrete, they all cut through the buried world, and sometimes they bring pieces of it back to light. The archaeologists who respond to these finds work under intense pressure. A construction schedule does not stop for a fragile layer of Bronze Age potsherds. Salvage excavations, as they are called, often have only days or weeks to document what a machine has exposed before the concrete is poured or the pipe is laid. And yet, some of the richest sites in the archaeological record come from exactly these rushed, emergency digs. The knowledge that the past is being destroyed even as it is being discovered adds an urgency to every accidental find. The farmer with his field and the quarry worker with his pick, they are not just finding old stones, they are handing us pieces of a story that we might otherwise have lost forever. A story written in the very soil that we are constantly reshaping for our own needs. And that means the next breakthrough could come from anywhere: a road-widening project on the outskirts of a modern city, a trench dug for a new fiber optic cable, a gardener turning over a patch of earth behind a suburban home. The ground beneath us is not silent. It is full of layers we have not yet learned to read, and sometimes all it takes is a shovel in the wrong place at the right time. Every accidental find delivers not just a new dot on the map, but a direct challenge to the old theories that defined what a city even was. Over the past few decades, the sheer weight of these discoveries has forced a quiet but profound revision inside the field of archaeology. The old checklist that a city needed walls, a palace, writing, and a clear dependence on irrigated grain no longer works. It never really did. It was simply the only tool available, and it shaped what researchers expected to see. Now the tool itself is being reshaped. The first change is in the definition of a city itself. For the better part of a century, The standard model held that a true city had to be densely packed, with people living close together inside a fortified perimeter. That description fit places like Uruk or Mohenjo-Daro, but it completely failed to capture the sprawling networks discovered in the Maya lowlands or the Amazon. Those settlements spread out over vast areas, with houses scattered across the landscape yet connected by roads, canals, and shared ceremonial centers. They were not dense in the modern sense. They were low-density urbanism, a pattern where the city itself was defined not by crowding but by connectivity. In this model, a farmer could live a kilometer from the nearest neighbor and still be part of an urban system. The fields were woven into the fabric of the settlement, not pushed outside some invisible wall. That idea would have been dismissed as nonsense a generation ago. Today, it is one of the most productive ways to think about the ancient world. The second shift is deeper still. It rewrites the relationship between farming and city building. The old story insisted that urban life was impossible without a reliable surplus of cereal grains, wheat, barley, rice, or maize. Those grains could be stored, traded, and taxed, providing the steady supply of calories that allowed non-farmers to survive. Without grain, the reasoning went, no city could feed itself. But Caral in Peru grew cotton, not food, and fed its people from the sea. The Amazonian settlements managed the forest itself, planting fruit trees and enriching the soil with charcoal, creating a landscape that produced food year-round without ever needing a plow. The Trypillia mega sites grew grain, but they did so on the deep black earth of the steppe, a soil that needed no irrigation and very little labor beyond planting and harvesting. The relationship was not one of necessity but of possibility. Agriculture helped, but it was not the only path. People found other ways to generate surplus and stability, and those ways did not always leave the same archaeological signature. The assumption that river valleys, with their predictable floods and alluvial soils, were the only cradle of civilization has collapsed under the weight of the evidence. This brings us to the third revision, the most uncomfortable for the old guard. The idea that complex societies only arose in those few privileged river valleys, the so-called cradles of civilization, was always more about cultural bias than about data. It placed a handful of regions at the center of history and treated everywhere else as a passive recipient of influence. The discoveries of the last 2 decades have flipped that map. The Andes, the Amazon, the West African floodplains, the Mississippi Basin, the Ukrainian steppe, all of them produced large, organized, and durable societies without needing the Tigris or the Nile. They did it in their own way, at their own pace, and often with materials that crumbled into the earth as soon as the settlements were abandoned. The River Valley model was not just incomplete. It was a straitjacket that prevented researchers from seeing what was right in front of them. Emerging from these revisions is a new framework, one that archaeologists are still learning to name. It is often called resilient socio-ecological systems, a mouthful of academic language that simply means people figured out how to live in a place for a long time without destroying the resources that kept them alive. The residents of Çatalhöyük managed their landscape for nearly 2,000 years, rebuilding the same houses on the same foundations, generation after generation, without exhausting the soil or the game. The engineers of the Amazon created terra preta, dark earth that remained fertile for centuries, a deliberate investment in the land that outlasted their own cities. The Trypillia communities rotated their settlements, abandoning them after a few hundred years and letting the fields recover before building anew. These were not fragile, desperate experiments. They were sustainable systems built on deep local knowledge and careful long-term planning. The old story saw cities as machines that consumed resources until they collapsed. The new story sees them as gardens that could be tended for centuries if the people who built them understood the land they lived on. this shift in perspective is still unfolding. It requires letting go of the tidy categories and the linear ladder of progress. It asks archaeologists to accept that a place can be a city without a king, without a granary, without a single monumental temple. It asks them to look for urban life not only in the densest clusters of ruins, but in the faint traces of a managed landscape, the networks of paths and canals and enriched soils that bound a scattered population into a single community. And it raises a quiet but insistent question. If the old definition of a city was so narrow that it excluded entire civilizations, how many other cities are still out there, waiting for a new set of eyes to see them? Climate itself is a hidden partner in this story. The map of where cities could rise was always drawn with a ruler calibrated to the present, but the climates of the past did not match the climates of today. The Sahara, that vast sea of sand and rock that we think of as empty, was not always so dry. Between roughly 10,000 and 5,000 years ago, a greener Sahara stretched across North Africa, a land of lakes, grasslands, and seasonal rivers. On the shores of those ancient lakes, people fished, herded cattle, and built settlements that left behind thousands of rock paintings. And in the heart of that green Sahara, in what is now southern Libya, a civilization carved out a lasting home. These were the Garamantes, a people who turned a harsh environment into a thriving urban landscape by learning to read the water hidden beneath the sand. They drilled deep wells into fossil aquifers, tapping reserves of ancient rainwater that had been trapped underground for millennia. With that water, they irrigated fields of wheat, barley, and dates, creating a chain of oasis towns, forts, and walled settlements that stretched across the Fezzan region. At their peak, around the first few centuries of the Common Era, the Garamantes controlled a network of trade routes that carried gold, salt, and slaves from sub-Saharan Africa to the Mediterranean coast. They built stone houses, raised monumental tombs, and fielded armies of charioteers that Roman writers both admired and feared. The same Sahara that today seems like a barrier to life was, for the Garamantes, a source of opportunity. But when the climate shifted again and the ancient aquifers began to run dry or their wells could no longer reach the dropping water table, their civilization slowly unraveled. The lesson is not that these cities were fragile, but that they were deeply tuned to a specific set of environmental conditions. Those conditions did not last forever, but while they did, the people who understood them built communities that rivaled anything on the Mediterranean coast. The same principle guided the Amazon. The dense forest we see today is not a reflection of an unchanging wilderness, but the result of a long relationship between human beings and the land. The Amazon of 1,000 years ago was not a pristine jungle. It was a carefully managed mosaic of fields, forests, and settlements, sustained by slightly different rainfall patterns and by the deliberate improvement of the soil. The people there created terra preta, the dark, rich earth that held nutrients even in the poor tropical soils. That was no accident. It was a technology, a slow, deliberate process of adding charcoal, bone, and organic waste over generations. The result was a landscape that could support dense populations, even as the surrounding forest was thin and acidic. The climate of the Amazon has always been wet and warm, but those conditions can also leach nutrients from the soil if the forest is not actively managed. The ancient inhabitants knew how to manage it. They planted fruit trees, built raised fields above the floodplains, and dug canals that drained and irrigated at the same time. Their settlements were not fighting the environment, they were weaving themselves into it. And then there are the grasslands, the Ukrainian steppe, that wide, wind-swept plain that stretches from the Carpathians to the Urals, seems like an unlikely home for a city. Winters are brutal, summers are dry, and the horizon is flat and endless. But beneath that grass lies some of the richest soil on Earth, a deep layer of black earth called Chernozem. That soil formed over thousands of years, a product of the slow decomposition of grasses under a specific climate pattern. The Trypilia people understood this land intimately. They built their large settlements on the best soils, planting their grain in a rotation that kept the earth fertile. The steppe had cycles of rain and drought, but the deep Chernozem acted like a sponge, holding moisture through dry spells and releasing it slowly. The Trypilia communities spread their settlements across the landscape, moving every few generations to allow the land to rest. They did not fight the climate, they worked with its rhythms. The very conditions that modern eyes see as harsh, the wind, the cold, the seasonal extremes, were part of a system that had sustained human life for millennia. The key to understanding these unexpected cities is to stop seeing climate as a fixed obstacle and to start seeing it as a variable that has changed constantly. The Sahara was green, the Amazon was a garden, the steppe was a breadbasket. Each of these environments at specific times and with specific human knowledge offered exactly what was needed for a dense population to thrive. And when the climate shifted again, or when the human knowledge was lost or the land was exhausted, those cities faded. But the fact that they faded does not make them less real or less remarkable. It makes them part of a larger pattern, one where adaptability, not location, was the real foundation of urban life. Many of these lost cities had no king at all. That fact alone should have been a clue that the old story was too narrow, but it took decades for archaeologists to take it seriously. The Trypilia mega sites of Ukraine offer the clearest example. Excavators have dug through entire neighborhoods, opened hundreds of houses, and sifted through layers of everyday life. What they have not found is any sign of a ruler. There are no palaces, no great storehouses that one family controlled, and no burials that stand out as richer or more elaborate than the rest. The resting places of the dead are spread evenly across the settlement, with similar offerings placed inside each grave. No one was buried with gold or copper ornaments. No single grave was marked with a stone slab or a mound that towered above the others. The houses themselves are remarkably uniform in size and layout. Each family dwelling had the same floor plan, the same number of rooms, the same kind of hearth. The only variation came from the crafts practiced inside. A potter might have extra storage for clay. A weaver might have a wider loom pit. But the basic structure of the home did not change from one end of the settlement to the other. This kind of material equality is deeply puzzling to researchers trained to look for hierarchy. How do you keep order among 10 or 15,000 people without a chief, a council of elders, or a written code of law? The answer seems to lie in systems of collective decision-making that left no physical trace. Perhaps they held assemblies in the open space at the center of each ring of houses, a natural gathering point where any adult could speak. Perhaps leadership rotated among households on a seasonal or yearly basis, so that no single person held power long enough to build a palace or demand tribute. Perhaps the community simply agreed to settle disputes by consensus, a tradition passed down through generations and enforced by social pressure rather than by armed guards. These ideas are not just speculation. Across many small-scale societies that survive into the modern era, anthropologists have documented exactly these patterns: councils of equals, temporary leaders chosen for specific tasks, and a deep commitment to preventing any one person from accumulating too much wealth or influence. The Trypilia people may have followed a similar playbook. Their massive settlements were not failures of centralization. They were successful experiments in a different kind of urban life, one that prioritized cooperation over control. And if that is true, then the assumption that cities require a king at the top has been blinding us to a whole range of possibilities. The question becomes not how these societies managed without a ruler, but whether the ruler-centered model was ever the only way to build a city at all. These settlements did not vanish without leaving a mark on the world. Their fates were varied, shaped by forces that no amount of cooperation could hold back forever. Some communities faced a slow unraveling as the climate shifted around them. The green Sahara began to dry, and the fossil aquifers that had sustained the Garamontes for centuries started to sink beyond the reach of their wells. Fields that once produced abundant harvests turned to dust, and the trade routes that had carried gold and salt across the desert began to shift toward new powers on the coast. The people adapted as long as they could, digging deeper wells, planting more resilient crops, and tightening their networks of exchange. But eventually, the land could no longer support the population it had once fed. Families moved away, first a few, then many, until the stone houses stood empty and the canals filled with sand. The same story played out in the Amazon, where the engineered landscapes of terra preta and raised fields required constant care and knowledge passed down through generations. When European contact brought disease and displacement, that knowledge was fractured, and the forest slowly swallowed the gardens. In the Mississippi Valley, Cahokia declined as the climate became cooler and drier, making it harder to sustain the intensive corn agriculture that had fed tens of thousands. The great mounds fell silent, and the people scattered into smaller communities, carrying memories of the city with them. Other settlements did not simply fade. They were absorbed into the growing empires that followed. The Trypillia mega sites were eventually abandoned, but the lands they had farmed and the routes they had established became part of a larger network that later Scythian and Slavic peoples would use. The city of Erlitou in China disappeared, but its bronze casting techniques and its grid-based planning influenced the Shang and Zhou dynasties that rose afterward, leaving a legacy in the very shape of Chinese urban design. The stone enclosures of Great Zimbabwe were not forgotten by the Shona people, who continued to regard the site as a sacred place, a symbol of their ancestors' achievements, even after the city itself had ceased to be a capital. What these stories reveal is not a tale of failure, but a testament to human flexibility. These were not brittle societies that collapsed at the first sign of trouble. They were dynamic systems that adapted to changing circumstances for centuries, sometimes for millennia, before finally reaching a tipping point. And that tipping point was often not a sudden disaster, but a slow drift of resources, climate, or trade connections that made their way of life no longer sustainable. The deeper lesson is that the capacity for cooperation, for building cities without kings, for managing landscapes without destroying them, was far more widespread in the ancient world than anyone ever imagined. These settlements were not isolated experiments that failed. They were part of a global tradition of urban life, one that took different forms on every continent and under every sky. Only now, with the new tools of LIDAR and geophysics and the willingness to challenge old assumptions, are archaeologists beginning to recognize these places as full members of the family of human cities. Their legacy is not in the ruins they left behind, but in the quiet reminder that there has always been more than one way to live together, and that is a story still being written, one new discovery at a time. The search for lost cities has only accelerated. Across Southeast Asia, new LIDAR flights are peeling back the jungle canopy over territories that have never been systematically scanned. In the dense forests of Cambodia, beyond the famous temple complex of Angkor, survey teams are finding entire networks of smaller settlements, linked by causeways and canals that were invisible to ground surveys for decades. The same technology is moving into the Congo Basin, one of the least explored regions on Earth. The rainforest there is thick, the terrain difficult, and the political instability has kept most archaeologists away for generations. But satellite data and preliminary LIDAR scans are already hinting at large geometric earthworks beneath the trees, patterns that look strikingly similar to the ones discovered in the Amazon. The Andes, too, remain a frontier. The high slopes and deep valleys of Peru and Bolivia hide countless pre-Columbian settlements that were never mapped because they were built from earth and stone that long ago collapsed into mounds of rubble. LIDAR surveys are now revealing the ghostly traces of terraced fields, fortified hilltops, and entire villages that once housed thousands, all hidden under the scrub and the mountain grass. In the Amazon, the discoveries keep coming. Excavations at newly identified geoglyph sites in the Brazilian state of Acre and the Bolivian Llanos de Mojos are unearthing pottery, tools, and food remains that tell a fuller story of the people who designed those massive earthworks. They were not just ceremonial centers, they were the foundations of a settled, agricultural society that harvested nuts and fruits, raised fish in managed ponds, and traded obsidian and semi-precious stones over long distances. The geoglyphs themselves, perfect circles and squares carved into the earth, are now understood as the outlines of plazas and defensive ditches, the skeletons of wooden towns that rotted away while the earthworks remained. The most exciting front may be the one that does not require setting foot in the field at all. Researchers are now using machine learning, a form of artificial intelligence, to predict where ancient settlements are most likely to be found. The algorithms are trained on thousands of known sites, learning the subtle patterns of elevation, soil composition, vegetation, and proximity to water that correlate with human occupation. Once trained, the model scans vast satellite images and generates a probability map, highlighting the patches of land where the unseen signature of a buried city is strongest. Ground teams then follow up with LIDAR or geophysical surveys, and the hit rate has been astonishing. In the Yucatan Peninsula, machine learning predictions led to the discovery of dozens of previously unmapped Maya structures, including a massive palace complex hidden under thick forest. In the Sahara, the same technique identified ancient riverbeds and lake shores where Neolithic settlements likely clustered, and subsequent surveys confirmed the presence of stone tools and pottery scattered across the surface. The pace of discovery is now measured in years, not decades. A region that would have taken a single archaeologist a lifetime to survey on foot can be mapped by a satellite in a single orbit and analyzed by a computer in a matter of hours. The result is a flood of new data, each dataset adding another cluster of dots to the map of where humans built their homes. In 10 years, that map will look almost nothing like the one we carry in our minds today. The empty spaces will shrink. The so-called margins will fill in with complex urban landscapes. The old cradle of civilization model will be replaced by a mosaic of independent innovations, each region finding its own path to density and organization. The technology is still improving, the training data is still being refined, and the most dramatic discoveries may lie ahead of us, hidden just beneath a layer of soil or a canopy of leaves, waiting for the next algorithm or the next laser pulse to bring them back into the light. And so the map of human achievement keeps expanding, not because we found the final piece, but because we keep discovering that the puzzle itself is far larger than we ever guessed. Every LIDAR flight, every geophysical survey, every accidental shovelful of earth that reveals a buried wall, each one chips away at the old story that once seemed so settled. The river valleys were never the only cradles. The marginal lands were never truly marginal. The people who built those massive settlements in the rainforests on the dry coasts and across the open steppes were not latecomers or imitators. They were innovators finding their own solutions to the challenges of living together in large numbers. Their cities did not fit the textbook definition, but that definition was always a product of limited vision, not of universal truth. What we are left with is a humbling realization. The history of urban life is not a single story with a neat beginning and a straight line of progress. It is a branching, tangled narrative with countless starting points, dead ends, and forgotten chapters. The most exciting part is that we are still in the middle of rewriting that narrative. For every lost city that has been found, a dozen more remain hidden beneath the canopy of a jungle, under the silt of a floodplain, or below the plowed fields of a modern farm. The next great discovery could come from anywhere, from a satellite image analyzed by an algorithm or from a farmer turning over a stone in a field. The quiet work of archaeology continues, and it will keep surprising us for decades to come. If you want to witness those surprises as they happen, if you want to see the old map shatter again and again, then hit that subscribe button and turn on the notification bell. This channel follows every new finding, every fresh twist in the story of where we came from. The past is not as distant as it seems, and the ground beneath our feet is still full of secrets. Stay curious, and I will see you in the next video.